The October leaves crunched under Harold Peterson's worn loafers as he walked up the brick pathway to his daughter Jennifer's colonial home in Shaker Heights, clutching a manila envelope that contained news he knew would detonate like a bomb in his family's carefully ordered world. At 67, Harold had learned that some conversations required neutral territory, and Jennifer's Sunday family dinners had become the Switzerland of Peterson family gatherings, a place where his 3 adult children could unite in their shared concern about his declining judgment since their mother's death 2 years earlier. The house, with its perfectly manicured lawn and imported German cars in the circular driveway, represented everything Harold had worked toward during his 40-year career as a high school principal. Jennifer, now 43, had married well, a cardiologist named David, who earned more in a month than Harold had made in a year during his peak earning years. But wealth, Harold had come to understand, didn't necessarily translate to wisdom or compassion. "Dad!" Jennifer's voice carried that particular note of forced cheerfulness that meant she was already bracing for whatever awkwardness he might bring to her elegant dinner party. "You're early. David's still getting ready, and the boys are finishing their homework." Harold embraced his daughter, noting how she subtly guided him toward the less formal living room, rather than the pristine sitting room she reserved for her medical society friends. At 43, Jennifer had inherited her mother's refined features and her father's analytical mind. But somewhere along the way, she'd also developed a need to control social situations that reminded Harold uncomfortably of his late wife's more challenging qualities. "Where are Michael and Sarah?" Harold asked, referring to his other 2 children who traditionally attended these monthly gatherings. "Michael's running late from his golf game. You know how those real estate deals can stretch into the weekend. And Sarah's bringing the kids after their soccer practice ends at 4. Harold nodded, settling into the leather chair that Jennifer had designated as his during these visits. The chair was comfortable, but positioned slightly apart from the main seating area, a subtle but consistent reminder that while he was welcome in his daughter's home, he remained something of an outsider to the lifestyle she'd built. Michael, at 39, had followed his father's example by building a successful career through steady work and reliable judgment, becoming one of Cleveland's most respected commercial real estate agents. But unlike Harold, who had chosen teaching out of genuine passion for education and community service, Michael seemed primarily motivated by the financial rewards and social status his profession provided. Sarah, the youngest at 35, had taken a different path entirely. As a marketing executive for a major corporation, she traveled constantly and had developed what Harold privately thought of as professional personality, charming, articulate, and somehow impersonal even during intimate family conversations. All 3 children had inherited their mother's intelligence and their father's work ethic, but Harold sometimes wondered if they'd also inherited Margaret's tendency towards social climbing and her subtle but persistent dissatisfaction with anything she perceived as beneath their station. Dad," Jennifer said, settling into the chair across from him, with the careful posture that suggested this was more interview than casual conversation. "We've all been worried about you since you stopped returning our calls last week." Harold felt a familiar tension building in his chest. His children's worry had intensified during the past 6 months, ever since he'd begun what they euphemistically called his social activities, a phrase that somehow made his attempts to rebuild a life after Margaret's death sound both pathetic and vaguely inappropriate. "I've been busy, sweetheart. There have been some changes in my life that required attention." Jennifer's expression sharpened with the focus she'd inherited from both parents, the ability to detect evasion and probe for information with surgical precision. "What kind of changes?" Before Harold could respond, the front door opened with the confident energy that always announced Michael's arrival. At 39, Michael Peterson looked like a successful man who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through networking, negotiation, or financial resources. His golf clothes were perfectly pressed, despite an afternoon on the course, and his smile had the practiced warmth of someone who made his living managing other people's expectations. "Dad, there you are," Michael said, crossing the room with the assertive stride that had made him successful in commercial real estate. "Jennifer said you had some kind of announcement to make. Please tell me you're not thinking about selling the house and moving to one of those senior communities." The assumption was typical Michael, immediate concern about practical implications, with emotional considerations treated as secondary factors to be managed rather than honored. "The house is fine, Michael. I'm comfortable there, and I have no intention of moving anywhere that would require me to give up my workshop or Margaret's garden." Sarah arrived moments later with her characteristic whirlwind energy, shepherding her two children, Emma, 11, and Jake, 9, into the living room, while simultaneously checking her phone and issuing instructions about homework and screen time limits. "Sorry I'm late," Sarah said, kissing Harold's cheek with the efficient affection of someone who had learned to express love in small doses between business calls. The kids' soccer ran into overtime, and then Emma decided she absolutely had to stop for a Starbucks Frappuccino, or her life would be ruined forever. Sarah had inherited her mother's ability to manage multiple priorities simultaneously, but Harold sometimes wondered if her children ever received her complete attention, or if they, like everyone else in her life, had become items to be efficiently managed rather than people to be deeply known. As the family settled into their usual configuration, the three siblings forming a semicircle with Harold as the focal point of their collective attention, Harold felt the familiar weight of being simultaneously beloved and scrutinized by people who cared deeply about his welfare but didn't necessarily respect his autonomy. "Kids," Jennifer called toward the stairs, "come say hello to Grandpa, then you can go back to your activities." Harold's 4 grandchildren appeared with the reluctant courtesy that characterized their interactions with him since Margaret's death. Not because they didn't love him, but because children were remarkably sensitive to adult anxiety, and Harold's children had been radiating concern about his judgment and mental state for months. After the grandchildren had dutifully hugged their grandfather and been dismissed to their rooms, Harold found himself facing the 3 adults who had once been the center of his world, but who now seemed to view him primarily as a problem requiring management. "Dad," Jennifer said, her tone carrying the gentle authority she'd probably perfected during years of managing her husband's medical practice. "We've been talking, and we're all concerned about some of the decisions you've been making since Mom died." Harold felt his jaw tighten. "What decisions?" Michael leaned forward, his expression showing the earnest concern of someone about to deliver difficult news. "The gambling, Dad. We know you've been spending time at the casino boat. We know you've been taking trips to Las Vegas. We're worried that grief might be affecting your judgment about financial risks." Harold stared at his son, genuinely confused. "What gambling?" "Dad, please don't make this harder than it needs to be," Sarah interjected, her voice carrying the impatient efficiency she used with uncooperative clients. "We've seen the credit card statements. We know about the cash withdrawals. We're not judging you. Grief makes people do things they wouldn't normally consider, but we need to address this before it gets worse." The accusations hit Harold like physical blows. His children had been monitoring his financial activities, making assumptions about his behavior, and holding family meetings to discuss his supposed deteriorating judgment. "I need you to listen very carefully," Harold said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded respect from hundreds of teenagers and their parents during his decades as a principal. "I have never gambled in a casino. I have never been to Las Vegas since your mother and I went for our 30th anniversary, and I have no idea what credit card statements or cash withdrawals you think you've seen, but they're not related to gambling." The silence that followed was dense with skepticism. Harold could see his children exchanging glances that suggested they thought he was either lying or experiencing memory problems that would require professional intervention. "Dad," Jennifer said gently, "we're not trying to embarrass you, but we have documentation." "Then show me the documentation." Jennifer disappeared into her home office and returned with a folder containing bank statements, credit card bills, and what appeared to be photographs taken with a cell phone. She spread the papers across the coffee table with the methodical precision of someone presenting evidence. Harold examined the documents, his confusion growing with each page. The bank statements showed cash withdrawals of several $100s every few weeks over the past 6 months. The credit card bills included charges at locations he didn't recognize, and the photographs showed someone who looked like him entering what was clearly a casino, but the person in the photographs wasn't him. "These charges," Harold said, pointing to the credit card statements, "I didn't make these. This casino, I've never been there. And this person in the photographs." He studied the images more carefully, noting details his children had apparently missed. "This man is about my age and build, but if you look closely, you can see he's wearing a wedding ring. I haven't worn a wedding ring since your mother died." Harold's children leaned forward, examining the evidence they'd been accumulating for weeks with fresh eyes. Michael was the first to speak. "Dad, if you didn't make these charges, and if that's not you in the photographs, then someone has been using your identity for gambling." "Or," Harold said, his voice growing stronger as he realized what had been happening, "someone has been deliberately creating evidence to make you think I've developed a gambling problem." The implications hung in the air like smoke. If Harold wasn't gambling, but someone wanted his children to believe he was, then there was a deliberate campaign to undermine their faith in his judgment and decision-making capacity. "Who would do something like that?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected this might be more complex than simple identity theft. Harold reached for the manila envelope he'd brought with him, understanding that his original announcement would now need to be prefaced with explanations about deception, manipulation, and the complicated motivations that drive people to elaborate schemes. "That," Harold said, "brings me to what I actually came here to tell you." He opened the envelope and pulled out several documents, official papers with gold seals and legal language that immediately captured his children's attention. "6 months ago, I married Elena Vasquez. These are copies of our marriage certificate, our joint bank account statements, and the updated will that reflects our new family status." The silence that followed was different from before, not skeptical, but shocked into complete stillness. Harold's children stared at the documents as if they contained information in a foreign language. "You got married!" Jennifer's voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad, you got married and didn't tell us." "I tried to tell you, multiple times, but every conversation we've had for the past 6 months has been about your concerns regarding my judgment, my finances, my social activities, and my supposed gambling problem. I finally realized that someone was actively sabotaging your perception of me to prevent exactly this conversation." Michael was reading the marriage certificate with the careful attention he applied to complex real estate contracts. "Elena Vasquez. Dad, who is Elena Vasquez?" Harold smiled for the first time since arriving at Jennifer's house. "She's a 62-year-old widow who has been cleaning houses for a living since her husband died 4 years ago. She's also the most intelligent, compassionate, and genuine person I've met since your mother passed away." Sarah's expression showed the kind of skeptical concern that had made her successful in corporate marketing, the ability to identify potential problems before they became crises. "Dad, How did you meet someone who cleans houses? And more importantly, how long have you known her before you decided to get married? I met Elena 18 months ago when she responded to my advertisement for someone to help maintain the house after Margaret died. She came once a week initially, but we began talking during her visits about books, current events, our experiences with loss and grief. She's read more literature than most people with advanced degrees, speaks 3 languages fluently, and has insights about human nature that come from decades of working in people's homes during their most vulnerable moments. Harold paused, noting how his children's expressions were shifting from shock towards something that looked like horror. We began having coffee together after she finished her work, then lunch, then dinner. She helped me understand that grief doesn't have to mean emotional death, and I helped her see that her intelligence and wisdom deserve to be recognized and valued, not just by me, but by everyone who meets her. "Dad," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the tone she'd probably used to address a patient's family member who was making poor medical decisions. "This woman, Elena, she cleans houses. She probably has no education, no resources of her own. Don't you see how this looks?" The question revealed everything Harold had feared about his children's reaction. They were focused on social status, financial implications, and appearances rather than on his happiness or his new wife's character. "How does it look, Jennifer?" "It looks like a woman who recognized a lonely widower with a comfortable retirement income and decided to secure her financial future by marrying him." The accusation hung between them like a blade. Harold felt anger building in his chest, not just at the insult to Elena, but at his children's assumption that his judgment had become so compromised that he couldn't distinguish between genuine affection and financial manipulation. "Elena," Harold said, his voice controlled but carrying unmistakable steel, "has never asked me for money. She insisted on continuing to work even after we married because she values her independence. She pays for her own groceries when she cooks dinner at our house, and she refused to let me buy her an engagement ring because she said our commitment didn't need expensive symbols." Harold could see that his defense of Elena was not reassuring his children, but rather confirming their worst fears about his susceptibility to manipulation. "Dad," Michael said, leaning forward with the earnest expression he used when explaining complex financial concepts to clients, "that's exactly what a sophisticated gold digger would do. She's playing a long game, establishing herself as selfless and independent while positioning herself to inherit everything you and Mom worked for." The conversation was spiraling toward exactly the confrontation Harold had hoped to avoid. His children were so committed to their narrative about Elena's motivations that they couldn't consider the possibility that she might genuinely care about him. "Which brings me to the will," Harold said, pulling out the legal document that would either resolve or escalate this family crisis. The updated will was 23 pages long, drafted by Cleveland's most respected estate planning attorney and legally bulletproof. Harold handed copies to each of his children and waited while they read through provisions that would fundamentally change their understanding of their father's priorities and values. Jennifer was the first to finish reading, her face pale with shock. Michael followed, his expression unreadable. Sarah read more slowly, her marketing background helping her analyze not just the legal language, but the strategic thinking behind each provision. "Dad," Jennifer said finally, "according to this will, Elena inherits the house, all your liquid assets, your pension benefits, and Mom's jewelry collection. We get token amounts, $5,000 each, and some personal items." "That's correct." "But Dad," Michael added, "this represents everything you and Mom built together over 40 years. Your entire life's work, gone to someone you've known for 18 months. Harold had expected this reaction, but hearing his children articulate their sense of betrayal and financial loss still caused him pain. "Read the final provisions," Harold said quietly. Sarah flipped to the last page of the will, her expression changing as she absorbed information that hadn't been immediately apparent. "There's a condition," she said slowly. "The inheritance to Elena is conditional on her surviving Dad by at least 1 year and using the assets to establish a scholarship fund for underprivileged students who want to pursue higher education." Michael grabbed the will from Sarah's hands, reading the final provisions with growing amazement. "Dad, this says that Elena can live in the house and use the income from your assets during her lifetime, but when she dies, everything goes to create an educational foundation in Mom's name. Elena doesn't actually inherit anything permanently. She's essentially the administrator of a charitable trust." Harold nodded. "Elena suggested that structure. She said she didn't need permanent wealth, but she thought Margaret would have loved the idea of helping young people access educational opportunities they couldn't otherwise afford." The revelation changed everything about the family's understanding of Elena's motivations and Harold's judgment. If Elena had been a gold digger, she would never have suggested a will structure that prevented her from actually inheriting Harold's wealth. "Dad," Jennifer said, her voice small and confused, "if Elena suggested giving away your money to charity, then she's not trying to steal our inheritance. No, sweetheart, she's trying to honor your mother's memory while ensuring that my assets serve a purpose larger than individual financial security." The manila envelope contained one more document, a letter addressed to Harold's children in Elena's careful handwriting. Harold handed it to Jennifer. "Elena wanted you to have this, regardless of how today's conversation went." Jennifer opened the letter and began reading aloud. "Dear Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah, by the time you read this letter, you will know about my marriage to your father and the changes we have made to his will. I want you to understand that I never asked for any inheritance, and I never expected your father to provide for me financially. What I asked for was the chance to love him and be loved in return during whatever time we have together. Your father talks about each of you constantly, your achievements, your families, your character. He is proud of the adults you have become, and he wants nothing more than your happiness and approval. If you cannot accept me as part of your family, I will understand, but I hope you can accept that your father deserves companionship and affection during his later years, and that my love for him is genuine rather than mercenary. The scholarship fund was my idea because I believe people should be remembered for the good they do in the world, not for the money they accumulate. Your mother, from everything your father has told me, was a woman who valued education and opportunity. I thought she would appreciate knowing that her life's work continues to help young people long after her death. I look forward to meeting you when you are ready, and I hope we can build a relationship based on our shared love for a man who deserves our respect and support. With sincere wishes for understanding, Elena Peterson. The letter created a silence different from any that had preceded it during the afternoon's revelations. Harold watched his children processing information that challenged every assumption they had made about his new wife and their father's judgment. "Dad," Sarah said finally, "we owe you an apology, and we owe Elena an apology. We made assumptions based on prejudice," Harold said gently, "based on the idea that someone who cleans houses for a living couldn't possibly be worthy of respect or genuine affection." Michael was staring at the marriage certificate as if seeing it clearly for the first time. "Dad, who created the fake gambling evidence? Who wanted us to think you were losing your judgment?" Harold smiled grimly. "That's a conversation for another day. Today, I just want you to know that I'm happy, I'm loved, and I've made decisions about my life and my money that reflect my values and priorities." As Harold prepared to leave Jennifer's house, carrying with him copies of documents that had changed his children's understanding of their father's marriage and their own assumptions about human nature. He reflected on how family relationships could be damaged not by malicious intent, but by limiting beliefs about what other people deserved and were capable of. His children would need time to process what they had learned, and even more time to examine their own prejudices about social class, education, and the forms that genuine love could take. But Harold was optimistic that truth, once revealed, would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken the bonds between them. The question was whether they would have that time, and whether the person who had tried to sabotage Harold's relationship with his children would make other attempts to destroy what Harold and Elena had built together. 3 days after Harold's revelation at Jennifer's house, he sat in the downtown Cleveland office of Detective Maria Santos, watching her examine the fabricated evidence that had nearly destroyed his relationship with his children. At 45, Detective Santos specialized in financial crimes and elder abuse, and her reputation for methodical investigation had made her the obvious choice when Harold decided he needed professional help uncovering who had orchestrated the sophisticated campaign to discredit him. "Mr. Peterson," Detective Santos said, spreading the fake casino photographs across her desk like playing cards, "whoever did this invested significant time and money in creating convincing evidence. These aren't amateur snapshots. They're professionally staged photographs taken with high-quality equipment." Harold studied the images with fresh eyes, noting details that his children's initial shock had prevented them from seeing clearly. The man in the photographs did indeed look remarkably similar to Harold. Same height, similar build, identical hair color and style. But the longer Harold examined them, the more obvious it became that someone had found what appeared to be his doppelganger and coached him to pose in ways that would be recognizable to Harold's family. "The credit card charges are more sophisticated," Detective Santos continued, pulling up information on her computer screen. "Someone opened accounts using your personal information, made charges consistent with gambling activity, then ensured the statements would be delivered to an address where your children would eventually see them. How would someone get access to my personal information?" Detective Santos had been investigating financial crimes long enough to recognize the patterns that characterize different types of fraud. Usually through someone who has legitimate access to your mail, your home, or your family relationships. "Mr. Peterson, I need to ask some difficult questions about people in your life who might have motivations to undermine your relationship with your children." Harold had been dreading this conversation, but he understood its necessity. "What kind of questions?" "Let's start with your new wife, Elena Vasquez. How much do you know about her background, her previous relationships, her financial situation before she married you?" The question struck Harold as both necessary and insulting. Necessary because Detective Santos was doing her job thoroughly. Insulting because it echoed his children's assumptions about Elena's character and motivations. "Elena has been cleaning houses in Cleveland for 15 years. She moved here from San Antonio after her first husband died in an industrial accident, and she worked multiple jobs to support herself and her teenage daughter, who is now a registered nurse in Houston." Harold pulled out his phone and showed Detective Santos photographs of Elena at work, Elena with her daughter Maria, Elena volunteering at the local library's literacy program. "She has never asked me for money, never shown interest in my financial situation beyond normal concerns about household budgeting, and she was the one who suggested the will structure that prevents her from permanently inheriting my assets." Detective Santos nodded, making notes on her legal pad. "What about other people in your life? Ex-employees from your years as a school principal, former colleagues who might have grievances, neighbors who have access to your mail or who know your routines?" Harold considered the possibilities. During 40 years as a high school principal, he had inevitably made decisions that disappointed some parents, disciplined some students, and occasionally had to terminate employees whose performance was inadequate. But the sophisticated nature of this fraud suggested someone with resources and skills beyond what most of those people would possess. "There is someone," Harold said slowly, realizing that his reluctance to suspect this particular person might have blinded him to obvious possibilities. "My sister-in-law, Patricia, Margaret's younger sister." Detective Santos looked up from her notes. "Tell me about Patricia." "Patricia Morrison. She's 59, works as an office manager for a private investigation firm, and she has always believed that Margaret married beneath her station when she chose me instead of pursuing relationships with men from more wealthy families." Harold felt uncomfortable articulating suspicions about someone who was technically family, but Detective Santos needed complete information to conduct an effective investigation. "Patricia has a key to my house. She's been helping with estate management since Margaret died. She receives copies of my financial statements because she was designated as backup executor for Margaret's will, and she's always been vocal about her belief that I don't deserve the lifestyle that Margaret's family money helped provide." Margaret's family money? Harold explained something he had never discussed with his children because it had never seemed relevant to their daily lives. Margaret had inherited a substantial trust fund from her grandmother, money that had helped purchase their home, fund their children's educations, and build the comfortable retirement that Harold's teaching salary alone would never have provided. Patricia always resented that Margaret chose love over financial advancement, and she's made no secret of her belief that our children should inherit everything Margaret brought to the marriage, rather than sharing it with Margaret's inappropriate choice of husband. Detective Santos was taking detailed notes, clearly recognizing patterns that suggested motive, means, and opportunity for the kind of sophisticated fraud they were investigating. "Mr. Peterson, has Patricia expressed opinions about your marriage to Eleanor?" "She's refused to meet Elena, refers to her as the cleaning lady when forced to acknowledge the marriage, and has made several comments about how Margaret would be devastated to know her money was going to support someone she would have considered unworthy of the family. And she has access to your personal information, your mail, and knowledge about your routines and relationships with your children?" Harold nodded, feeling sick as he realized how perfectly Patricia was positioned to orchestrate exactly the kind of campaign that had nearly destroyed his relationships with Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah. "Detective Santos, if Patricia is responsible for this, what kind of legal consequences could she face?" "Identity theft, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and depending on how much money was involved in the fake credit card accounts, potentially federal charges that carry significant prison time." The conversation was interrupted by Harold's phone ringing. The caller ID showed Elena's number, and Harold could hear distress in her voice even before he answered. "Harold, I'm at the house and something's wrong. The front door was open when I got home from the grocery store, and it looks like someone has been going through our papers." Detective Santos immediately gestured for Harold to put the call on speaker. "Elena, are you safe? Are you still in the house?" "I'm in the backyard now." "Harold, I called 911, but before the police get here, you need to know that someone took specific things, your financial records, some of Margaret's personal items, and the copies of our marriage certificate and will that we kept in the desk drawer." Harold felt cold dread settling in his stomach. If Patricia was responsible for the previous fraud, and if she was now escalating to breaking and entering, Eleanor could be in genuine physical danger. "Elena, stay outside until the police arrive. Don't go back into the house alone. Detective Santos was already reaching for her radio, coordinating with the responding officers, and requesting that the house be processed as a crime scene rather than a simple burglary. "Mr. Peterson, I need you to call your children and make sure they're safe. If someone is willing to break into your house during daylight hours, this situation has moved beyond financial fraud into potentially violent criminal behavior." Harold called Jennifer first, reaching her at her medical practice where she was between patients. "Dad, what's wrong? You sound scared." "Jennifer, I need you to listen carefully. Someone broke into the house today while Elena was grocery shopping. They took financial records and personal documents. Detective Santos thinks this might be connected to whoever created the fake gambling evidence." Jennifer was quiet for a moment, processing implications that extended beyond Harold's immediate safety to potential threats against his entire family. "Dad, do you think we're all in danger?" "I don't know. But I need you to call Michael and Sarah, and I need all of you to be careful about strangers, unusual activities around your homes, or anyone asking questions about me or Eleanor." "Should we come to the house?" "No. Stay away until the police have finished their investigation." "I'll call you tonight when I know more." Harold ended the call and turned back to Detective Santos, who had been listening while coordinating the investigation with multiple law enforcement agencies. "Mr. Peterson, based on what's happened today, I'm recommending that you and Elena stay somewhere else tonight. If this person is willing to break into occupied houses during daylight hours, they may be desperate enough to escalate to more dangerous behavior." "Do you really think Patricia would hurt Eleanor physically?" Detective Santos had investigated enough domestic and family-related crimes to understand how quickly financial disputes could transform into violence, especially when the perpetrator felt cornered by investigation or exposure. "I think anyone capable of orchestrating the kind of elaborate fraud we've uncovered is also capable of other criminal behavior if they feel threatened. Your decision to involve law enforcement may have convinced Patricia that she needs to take more drastic action to protect herself." Harold's phone rang again, this time showing Patricia's number. Detective Santos immediately gestured for him to answer while she activated recording equipment. "Harold, I just heard about the break-in at your house. Are you and Elena safe?" Patricia's voice carried exactly the right note of concerned family member, but Harold now heard something else underneath, a tension that suggested she knew more about the situation than she was admitting. "We're fine, Patricia. The police are investigating." "Thank goodness. Harold, I've been thinking about our last conversation and I owe you an apology. I know I've been critical of your marriage to Elena, but family is family, and I want us to work through our differences." Harold exchanged glances with Detective Santos, who was taking notes about the timing and content of Patricia's suddenly conciliatory call. "I appreciate that, Patricia. In fact, I'd like to invite you and Elena to dinner tomorrow night. It's time I got to know her properly, and I think we could all benefit from clearing the air about recent tensions." The invitation, coming just hours after someone had broken into Harold's house, felt like a trap rather than an olive branch. Detective Santos was shaking her head emphatically, clearly recognizing the danger of accepting such an invitation under current circumstances. "That's generous, Patricia, but Elena and I are going to stay with Jennifer for a few days while the police complete their investigation." "Oh. Well, perhaps when things settle down then." After Harold ended the call, Detective Santos replayed the recording, highlighting phrases and vocal patterns that suggested deception. "Mr. Peterson, Patricia's call came exactly 43 minutes after the break-in was reported to 911. Unless she has police scanners or contacts within law enforcement, the timing suggests she already knew about the break-in before it was publicly reported." Harold felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrible clarity. Patricia had access to his house, knowledge of his routines, familiarity with his family relationships, and both motive and means to orchestrate the financial fraud that had nearly destroyed his relationship with his children. Detective Santos, what do we do now? Now we build a case that will hold up in court. That means collecting evidence, documenting Patricia's access and opportunity, and probably setting up controlled circumstances where she might reveal her involvement in crimes we can prove. Harold understood that the investigation would require him to participate in strategies that felt deceptive, even if they were legally necessary to protect his family and ensure Patricia faced appropriate consequences for her actions. Is Elena in danger? Detective Santos had worked enough elder abuse cases to recognize when financial crimes were likely to escalate into physical violence. Potentially, yes. Patricia has invested significant time and resources in preventing your marriage from being accepted by your family. If she believes that legal investigation will expose her crimes, she may decide that eliminating Elena is her only option for avoiding prosecution. The conversation was interrupted by another call, this time from the officers investigating the break-in at Harold's house. Mr. Peterson, we found something you need to know about. Can you come to the house and bring Detective Santos if she's available? Harold and Detective Santos drove to his house in tense silence, both understanding that whatever the investigating officers had discovered would either solve the mystery of who was targeting Harold's family or escalate the situation into something even more dangerous than they had previously imagined. As they pulled into Harold's driveway, surrounded by police cars and crime scene tape, Harold realized that his decision to remarry had unleashed forces that threatened not only his happiness, but potentially the safety of everyone he loved. The question was whether they could gather enough evidence to stop Patricia before she decided that murder was preferable to imprisonment. The forensics team working Harold's house had been methodical in their examination, but it was what they found hidden in Margaret's old sewing room that transformed the investigation from financial fraud into something far more sinister. Detective Santos stood in the small upstairs room, now serving as Patricia's secret command center, surrounded by evidence of a 2-year campaign of surveillance, manipulation, and escalating criminal behavior that painted a disturbing picture of obsession disguised as family loyalty. Mr. Peterson, Officer Rodriguez said, gesturing toward a desk that had been carefully concealed behind Margaret's old dressmaker's dummy and fabric storage. Your sister-in-law has been using this room as a base of operations for extensive surveillance of you, your children, and Elena. Harold stared at the elaborate setup, multiple computer monitors, professional photography equipment, detailed files on every member of his family, and printed schedules tracking his daily routines, Elena's work appointments, and his children's social activities. The level of planning and surveillance was beyond anything he had imagined possible. This is how she knew when your house would be empty, Detective Santos explained, pointing to handwritten logs documenting Elena's grocery shopping patterns, Harold's doctor appointments, and even the times when neighbors typically walked their dogs. Patricia has been watching you for months, maybe longer. Harold approached one of the filing cabinets, where manila folders were labeled with family members' names. His own file was 3 inches thick, containing copies of medical records, financial statements, and even transcripts of phone conversations he'd had with his children. How did she get access to medical records? Her employer is a private investigation firm, Detective Santos reminded him. She would have had access to resources and techniques that most people couldn't imagine. The question is how long this has been going on and what her ultimate goal was. Elena's file was smaller but more disturbing. It contained detailed background information about her previous employment, her financial struggles as a widow, photographs taken without her knowledge, and what appeared to be character assessments written in Patricia's careful handwriting. "Listen to this," Officer Rodriguez said, reading from Elena's file. "Subject continues to present herself as financially independent and uninterested in monetary gain." This suggests either genuine character, unlikely given her social class, or sophisticated long-term planning, more probable. Recommend escalating interventions to expose her true motivations before she secures legal position through marriage. Harold felt sick reading Patricia's clinical analysis of the woman he loved, noting how Patricia had interpreted Elena's genuine character as evidence of deception rather than authenticity. Jennifer's file revealed the source of his children's concerns about his supposed gambling problem. Patricia had been feeding them carefully selected evidence for months, using her position as trusted family member to gradually convince them that Harold's judgment was deteriorating. "Look at this," Detective Santos said, pulling out a folder labeled Phase 2 Implementation. Inside were detailed plans for escalating the campaign against Harold's marriage, including strategies for having him declared incompetent, plans for challenging his will in court, and most chilling of all, contingency plans labeled physical intervention scenarios. Harold read over Detective Santos's shoulder, his blood turning cold as he absorbed the implications of Patricia's methodical planning. She was going to have me declared mentally incompetent? That appears to have been her primary strategy, Detective Santos confirmed. Create evidence of poor judgment, convince your children you were being exploited, then petition the court for guardianship that would give her control over your financial decisions. Officer Rodriguez had found another folder that made everyone in the room pause. It was labeled Elena Problem Resolution and contained research about household accidents, medication interactions, and what appeared to be floor plans of Harold's house with specific rooms marked for staged incident locations. "Mr. Peterson," Detective Santos said, her voice carrying the gravity of someone who had seen enough criminal cases to recognize when financial fraud was escalating toward homicide, "I think Patricia was planning to kill Eleanor and make it look like an accident." Harold stared at the documents, trying to process the reality that someone he'd known for 25 years, someone he'd considered family, had been planning not just to steal his money, but to murder his wife. Why? Patricia already had access to Margaret's family money through the trust fund arrangements. She had influence with my children. Why go this far? Detective Santos had investigated enough family-related crimes to understand the psychological patterns that drove people from financial manipulation to violence. Because Elena represented something Patricia couldn't control or manipulate. As long as you were a lonely widower making poor financial decisions, Patricia could position herself as the family's voice of reason and gradually assume control over your assets. But Elena's influence over you, and especially her suggestion about the charitable foundation, threatened Patricia's long-term financial plans. Harold's phone rang. Patricia again. Detective Santos immediately signaled for him to answer while activating recording equipment. "Harold, I'm so sorry to bother you again, but I just remembered something that might be important for the police investigation." Patricia's voice carried concern that sounded genuine, but Harold now recognized the calculated performance underneath her apparent worry. "What did you remember, Patricia?" "Well, I was thinking about who might have had access to your personal information, and I realized that Elena has keys to your house, knowledge of your routines, and she would certainly benefit if something happened to damage your relationship with your children." Harold felt rage building as he realized Patricia was trying to redirect suspicion toward Elena, even while surrounded by evidence of her own elaborate criminal conspiracy. "Patricia, that's an interesting theory. I know it's painful to consider, Harold, but think about it logically. Elena appears in your life just as you're most vulnerable after Margaret's death. She encourages you to change your will in ways that benefit her. And now suddenly there are all these mysterious problems that make your children suspicious of your judgment. Detective Santos was taking notes about Patricia's attempt to manipulate Harold, even during an active criminal investigation of her activities. Harold, I think you should be very careful about trusting Elena until the police complete their investigation. In fact, maybe you should stay somewhere else tonight, somewhere Elena doesn't know about, just to be safe. The suggestion that Harold should hide from his own wife while Patricia remained free to continue her criminal activities felt like psychological warfare disguised as family concern. I'll consider your advice, Patricia. Good. And Harold, I want you to know that whatever happens, you're still family, and I'll always be here to help you make good decisions. After ending the call, Harold looked around the room that had served as Patricia's headquarters for surveilling and manipulating his family, understanding now how thoroughly she had invaded their privacy and twisted their relationships. Detective Santos, how do we stop her? We need to catch her in the act of committing a crime we can prove in court. Everything we've found here is compelling evidence, but a good defense attorney could argue that Patricia was conducting legitimate investigation out of concern for your welfare. Harold understood the legal complexities, but he was also deeply worried about Elena's safety while they gathered prosecutable evidence. What about a controlled operation, something where Patricia reveals her criminal intent while we're recording? Detective Santos nodded. That's exactly what I was thinking. We set up a scenario where Patricia believes she has an opportunity to achieve her goals, but where we control the variables and ensure everyone's safety. Officer Rodriguez had been examining Patricia's computer equipment and found something that changed their strategic options. Detective Santos, you need to see this. Patricia has been monitoring Elena's work schedule, and she's planned something for tomorrow afternoon when Elena is scheduled to clean the Johnsons' house on Maple Street. The computer screen showed detailed notes about Elena's Thursday routine. She would be alone in an unfamiliar house, her car would be parked in a secluded driveway, and she typically spent 2 hours cleaning without interruption. This looks like Patricia was planning to confront Elena tomorrow, possibly violently. Detective Santos immediately began coordinating with other officers to set up surveillance and protection for Elena's work appointment. But Harold had a different idea. What if we use Patricia's plan against her? What if Elena appears to be alone tomorrow, but we're actually there waiting? Mr. Peterson, that would put your wife in significant danger. More danger than she's already in? Patricia knows Elena's schedule, knows her routines, and has already demonstrated willingness to break into our house. If we don't stop her tomorrow, she'll just try again when we're not prepared. Harold's logic was sound, but Detective Santos had to balance the effectiveness of the operation against the safety risks for civilian participants. If we do this, Elena would be wearing recording equipment and panic buttons. We'd have officers positioned throughout the neighborhood, and we'd intervene at the first sign of physical threat. Harold nodded, understanding that they were planning to use Elena as bait to catch a woman who had already demonstrated capacity for elaborate criminal planning and potential violence. I'll call Elena and explain the situation. This has to be her decision. Elena was cleaning a house in Shaker Heights when Harold reached her, and he could hear the sounds of vacuum cleaners and running water in the background, the soundtrack of honest work that Patricia had used to justify treating Elena as unworthy of respect or consideration. Harold, are you safe? The police called and said I shouldn't go home tonight. We're both safe, and we have a plan to stop Patricia. But Elena, it involves some risk for you, and I won't ask you to do anything you're not completely comfortable with. Harold explained the trap they wanted to set, Patricia's apparent plan to confront Elena during her work appointment tomorrow, and the law enforcement resources that would be positioned to ensure her safety. Elena, if this feels too dangerous, we'll find another way. Your safety is more important than catching Patricia. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and Harold could picture her processing the information with the careful thought she applied to all important decisions. Harold, this woman has been trying to destroy our marriage, steal your money, and turn your children against you for years. If we don't stop her now, she'll keep escalating until someone gets hurt. But Elena, but nothing. I've been dealing with people who underestimate me my whole life. Tomorrow, Patricia is going to discover what happens when you threaten someone who's fought for everything she has. Elena's voice carried a steel that Harold had heard before when she defended her daughter against discriminatory teachers, when she advocated for fair wages from exploitative employers, when she stood up to people who assumed her occupation made her opinions less valuable. Besides, Elena continued, I want to look this woman in the eye and ask her why she thought destroying your happiness was more important than honoring your dead wife's memory. Harold felt simultaneous pride in Elena's courage and terror about the risks she was volunteering to face. Detective Santos wants to meet with you tonight to go over safety protocols and recording equipment. Good. Harold, tomorrow we end this. Patricia Morrison is about to learn that the cleaning lady is much more dangerous than she imagined. As Harold ended the call, he realized that the woman he had married for companionship and comfort possessed depths of strength and determination that made her not just worthy of his love, but worthy of his admiration. Tomorrow would determine whether Elena's courage and the careful planning of law enforcement would be enough to stop a woman whose obsession with controlling Harold's life had transformed her into someone capable of murder. The question was whether they had correctly anticipated Patricia's methods, or whether her years of planning would give her advantages they hadn't considered. Either way, Harold understood that by tomorrow evening, his family's ordeal would either be over, or Elena might be dead. Harold Peterson stood in the visitation room of the Cuyahoga County Jail, separated from his sister-in-law Patricia by reinforced glass and the weight of revelations that had fundamentally changed his understanding of the woman who had been part of his family for 25 years. Patricia Morrison, now awaiting sentencing on charges of identity theft, elder abuse, stalking, and attempted murder, looked smaller than he remembered, diminished not just by the orange jumpsuit and institutional setting, but by the collapse of the elaborate facade she had maintained for years. Thank you for coming, Harold, Patricia said, her voice carrying none of the manipulative warmth that had characterized their previous interactions. I wasn't sure you would. Harold studied his former sister-in-law, noting how imprisonment had stripped away the carefully maintained appearance that had helped her present herself as a concerned family member rather than a calculating criminal. Her grey hair was pulled back severely, her face pale without makeup, and her eyes carried a resignation that suggested she had finally accepted the consequences of choices that had escalated far beyond whatever she had originally intended. Elena thought I should hear what you had to say before the sentencing hearing next week. The mention of Elena's name caused Patricia to flinch slightly, a reaction that reminded Harold of the depth of obsession and hatred that had driven Patricia to plan his wife's murder. How is Elena? Harold considered how to answer. Elena had recovered physically from the confrontation that had ended Patricia's criminal campaign, but the emotional impact of discovering that someone had spent years planning her death would probably affect her for the rest of her life. She's strong. Stronger than you ever gave her credit for. Patricia nodded, acknowledging a truth that had cost her everything to learn. Harold, I want you to know that I never intended for things to go as far as they did. Harold had heard similar claims from Patricia during her arrest, her preliminary hearings, and her plea bargain negotiations. But sitting across from her now, seeing the genuine exhaustion and defeat in her face, he wondered if there might be some truth in her assertion. "How far did you intend for them to go?" Patricia was quiet for a long moment, apparently organizing thoughts she had been avoiding during months of legal proceedings. "Initially, I just wanted to prevent you from making what I saw as a terrible mistake. Margaret had been my older sister, my role model, everything I aspired to be. When she died, I felt responsible for protecting the life you had built together." Harold could hear in Patricia's voice the rationalization that had allowed her to justify increasingly extreme behavior as family loyalty rather than criminal obsession. "Patricia, Margaret chose me. She chose our life together. She chose to share her family's money with someone you considered unworthy, but those were her decisions, not yours to correct. I know that now. But at the time, watching you fall in love with someone who cleaned houses, Harold, I couldn't understand how you could replace Margaret with someone so different from everything she represented." Harold felt anger building, but also recognition that Patricia's prejudices about social class and education had blinded her to Elena's actual character and worth. "Elena didn't replace Margaret. She gave me a reason to live after Margaret died. There's a difference." Patricia's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion Harold had seen from her since her arrest. "I realize that now. Harold, when I was considering hurting Elena, I went to your house one afternoon when you were both out, and I saw the scholarship applications on your kitchen table." Harold remembered the afternoon Patricia was referring to. He and Eleanor had spent hours reviewing applications from high school students who wanted to attend college, but lacked the financial resources to make it possible without assistance. Elena had written personal notes on each application, Harold. Not just financial assessments, but notes about these kids' dreams, their family situations, the obstacles they were trying to overcome. She knew details about their lives that had nothing to do with money. Patricia paused, clearly struggling to articulate realizations that had come too late to prevent the damage she had caused. "I realized that Elena cared more about those students than I had ever cared about anyone except Margaret. She was using her position in your life to help people, while I was using mine to hurt them." Harold could see that Patricia's recognition of Elena's character had been one of the factors that led to her guilty plea, rather than a trial that would have forced her to publicly defend actions she could no longer justify to herself. "Patricia, what happened the day you confronted Elena at the Johnson house?" Harold had read the police reports and heard Elena's account, but he had never heard Patricia's version of the confrontation that had finally ended her campaign against their marriage. "I went there planning to hurt her. I had convinced myself that eliminating Elena was the only way to restore your family to what I thought it should be." Patricia's voice was barely audible as she described the afternoon that had transformed her from someone who saw herself as protecting family values into someone who recognized herself as a dangerous criminal. "But when I got there, Elena wasn't afraid of me. She invited me in, offered me coffee, and asked me to explain why I thought destroying your happiness would honor Margaret's memory." Harold had always admired Elena's courage, but her decision to engage Patricia in conversation rather than immediately calling for police backup had been either brilliantly strategic or incredibly dangerous. "What did you tell her?" "I told her everything. About the fake gambling evidence, about my plans to have you declared incompetent, about my belief that she was exploiting your grief for financial gain." Patricia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the gesture making her look older and more vulnerable than Harold had ever seen her. And Elena listened to all of it without getting angry or defensive. Then she asked me one question that changed everything. What question? She asked me if I thought Margaret would be proud of what I was doing to protect her memory. The question hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of moral judgment that had apparently penetrated Patricia's elaborate justifications for her criminal behavior. I couldn't answer her, Harold, because I knew that Margaret would have been horrified by everything I had done. Margaret loved you enough to choose you over wealthier men, and she would have wanted you to find love again rather than spend the rest of your life mourning her. Harold realized that Elena's strategy had been more sophisticated than simple courage. She had forced Patricia to confront the contradiction between her stated motivations and her actual actions. What happened next? Elena told me that she understood why I was suspicious of her, that she probably would have been suspicious too if someone had married her brother-in-law so soon after her sister's death. Patricia's description revealed Elena's empathy even for someone who had been planning to kill her, a level of emotional maturity that Patricia was apparently still processing months later. Then she showed me the will provisions that I had tried so hard to prevent. Harold, she walked me through every detail of the scholarship fund, explained how it would work, showed me letters from students who had already received help. Harold remembered Eleanor insisting on carrying copies of the scholarship materials with her, partly for practical reasons, but partly because the letters from grateful students represented the meaning and purpose that had emerged from their marriage. She proved to me that marrying you had made her not richer, but more generous, more committed to helping other people achieve things she never could. Patricia paused again, clearly struggling with emotions she had been avoiding during months of legal proceedings. Harold, Elena saved my life that day. What do you mean? I mean that if I had hurt her, if I had followed through on my plans, I would have become someone I couldn't live with. Elena gave me the chance to see what I was becoming before it was too late to choose differently. Harold understood that Patricia's recognition of Elena's character had led not only to her guilty plea, but also to whatever personal redemption might be possible after such extensive criminal behavior. Patricia, what do you want from this conversation? I want Elena to know that she was right about everything. About love being more important than money, about honoring people's memory by continuing their values rather than preserving their possessions, about treating people with dignity regardless of their social status. Patricia looked directly at Harold for the first time during their conversation. And I want you to know that Margaret would have loved Eleanor, not just because Eleanor makes you happy, but because Eleanor embodies the generosity and compassion that Margaret valued most. Harold felt tears beginning to form, understanding that Patricia's words represented not just personal apology, but recognition of truths that had been obvious to everyone except her. Will you give Elena a message for me? What message? Tell her that she taught me something about the difference between protecting people and controlling them. And tell her that the scholarship fund she created will help more young people than I ever helped during all my years of thinking I knew what was best for everyone. Harold nodded, knowing that Elena would appreciate Patricia's recognition, even as she continued to process the trauma of being stalked and threatened by someone who had claimed to care about family welfare. As Harold prepared to leave, Patricia asked one final question. Harold, do you think there's any chance your children will ever forgive me? Harold considered the question carefully. Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah had been devastated to learn how thoroughly Patricia had manipulated their perceptions and nearly destroyed their relationship with their father and Elena. Patricia, I think forgiveness is possible, but trust isn't. You'll have to live with the fact that your actions damaged relationships that can't be fully repaired. Patricia nodded, accepting a judgment that was harsh, but probably more merciful than what she deserved. I understand. Harold, thank you for listening. And thank you for showing me what real love looks like, even though I tried so hard to destroy it. Harold stood in the community center conference room, surrounded by the first recipients of the Margaret Peterson Educational Foundation scholarships, watching Eleanor work with high school students who were preparing for college with resources they never could have accessed without the help that had emerged from the most painful chapter of his life. 23 students had received full scholarships in the Foundation's first year, chosen not just for academic achievement, but for their demonstrated commitment to helping their communities and their determination to overcome economic obstacles that might have prevented them from pursuing higher education. "Mr. Peterson," said Maria Santos, a 17-year-old who planned to study engineering, "Elena told us that this foundation exists because your wife believed education could change people's lives. We want you to know that we're going to prove her right." Harold felt the kind of deep satisfaction that had been missing from his life since Margaret's death. The sense that his personal choices were contributing to something larger and more meaningful than his own happiness. Elena approached him, carrying a folder of thank-you letters from scholarship recipients and their families. At 63, she looked more confident and fulfilled than she had during their early married years, as if surviving Patricia's attacks had confirmed her worth in ways that Harold's love alone couldn't provide. "Harold, the Johnsons called this morning. They want to make a major donation to the foundation, specifically to fund scholarships for students whose parents work in service industries." Harold smiled, understanding that the family whose house had been the site of Elena's confrontation with Patricia now wanted to honor Elena's courage and the values the scholarship program represented. How much did they want to donate? $50,000 annually for the next 10 years. "Harold, we're going to be able to help hundreds of students." Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah had gradually rebuilt their relationships with Harold and Elena during the year since Patricia's sentencing. The process had been complicated by their guilt about believing Patricia's lies, their embarrassment about their prejudices regarding Elena's background, and their admiration for Elena's grace in forgiving them for assumptions that had caused real pain. "Dad," Jennifer had said during one of their reconciliation conversations, "I'm sorry it took almost losing you to realize that you had found something precious with Elena. I was so focused on protecting what Mom left behind that I couldn't see that you were creating something new that would honor her memory." Michael had expressed similar sentiments while helping Elena organize the scholarship selection process, contributing his business skills to ensure the foundation operated efficiently and effectively. Sarah had perhaps shown the most growth, using her marketing expertise to help the foundation reach students who might not otherwise know that college funding was available, and developing relationships with Elena that were based on genuine respect rather than obligatory family courtesy. As the scholarship reception concluded and students began leaving with information about college preparation programs, financial aid resources, and mentorship opportunities, Harold reflected on how Patricia's attempt to destroy his marriage had ultimately strengthened not only his relationship with Eleanor, but his connections with his children and his sense of purpose in his later years. "Elena, do you ever regret marrying into such a complicated family?" Elena laughed, the sound carrying the contentment of someone who had found not just love, but meaningful work that validated her intelligence and compassion. "Harold, every family is complicated. The difference is whether the complications bring out people's best qualities or their worst ones." She gestured toward the departing students, many of whom had stayed late to talk with Elena about their college plans, their career dreams, and their gratitude for opportunities they had never expected to receive. "Patricia's attacks forced your children to examine their own values and decide what kind of people they wanted to be. They chose growth over prejudice, relationship over pride. That's not complicated, that's beautiful. Harold understood that Elena had found in his family's crisis an opportunity to demonstrate not just her own character, but her ability to inspire others toward their better selves. Besides, Elena added with a smile that reminded Harold why he had fallen in love with her, I've spent my whole life dealing with people who underestimated me because of what I did for work. At least your family learned to see past their assumptions. Patricia never did. As they prepared to leave the community center, Harold's phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia, who was serving an 8-year sentence but was allowed limited contact with family members. The message was brief. Saw news story about foundation scholarships in prison library. Margaret would be proud. I'm proud. Thank you for not giving up on doing good despite what I tried to take away. Harold showed the message to Elena, who read it with the thoughtful expression she applied to complex problems that required both practical solutions and emotional wisdom. Harold, do you think Patricia has really changed? I think Patricia has learned the difference between loving someone and controlling them. Whether that's permanent change or temporary remorse, I guess we'll find out when she's released. Elena nodded, understanding that forgiveness didn't require trust, and that Patricia's recognition of her mistakes didn't erase the consequences of her actions. Either way, Elena said, taking Harold's hand as they walked toward their car, we've built something good from something terrible. The students we're helping will help others someday, and Margaret's memory will live on through their achievements rather than through preserved possessions. Harold squeezed Elena's hand, understanding that their marriage had survived not just Patricia's attacks, but the deeper challenge of creating a new life together, while honoring the past that had shaped both of them. Sometimes, Harold reflected as they drove home through the Cleveland neighborhoods, where Eleanor had worked for so many years, the greatest gifts came disguised as the worst betrayals. Patricia's attempt to destroy their marriage had instead revealed its strength. His children's initial rejection had evolved into deeper acceptance, and Eleanor's grace under attack had proven her worth to everyone who had witnessed it. The question was no longer whether Harold deserved Elena's love, or whether Eleanor was worthy of Harold's family's respect. The question was what they would do with the second chances that had emerged from crisis, and how many other lives they could touch through the foundation that had grown from the ashes of Patricia's hatred. As they pulled into their driveway, passing the garden where Elena now grew vegetables for the community food bank alongside Margaret's roses, Harold understood that the best revenge against those who tried to destroy love was to use that love to create something beautiful in the world.